who makes that choice? The answer in neoclassical economics, of course, is individuals. They emphasize individuals to the extent of advocating what they call methodological individualism, namely the view that every explanation has to ultimately end in individuals. So nothing like classes. I mean, classes are made up of individuals, so in order to properly understand what, say, Marxists call the working class, you need to go down to the individual level and explain the choices made by those individuals and aggregate them to more macro dimension. Now, this individualist vision is, of course, not the only way to theorize about economy and society, but this has been the dominant way, at least in the last few decades, since the 1980s. This individualist vision is essentially a parable of individual freedom. So, the vision is that individuals can get anything they want if they are willing to pay the right price. Whether it's ethically sourced food or some toy that the children will forget by next Christmas, people can produce anything without being told what to produce. If they can make money, they can use that production method that they find most profitable, whether it's, some microchip made with high-tech machines or, footballs owned by some poor children in Pakistan. There's no higher authority, whether it's the Central Planning Board of Soviet style or feudal lord or even the Pope, who can dictate what individuals should do. So that's a very kind of powerful message. This is about freedom. And on this basis, actually, many free market economists have argued that there's an inseparable relationship between economic freedom and political freedom. And this is the very influential message coming from books like Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom or Milton Friedman's Free to Choose. Moreover, the individualist view provides a paradoxical but very powerful moral justification of the market mechanism. We as individuals all make choices only for ourselves in this vision. We are not trying to further some greater good, But the paradoxical result is the maximization of social welfare. And in this vision, we don't need individuals to be good to run an efficient economy. Indeed, the individualist visionaries would argue that it's exactly because people are bad, people are self-seeking, that the economy is efficient. In this context, this quote from Adam Smith has been very popular. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. In a similar context, Milton Friedman said that duty of corporations is ruthlessly maximizing profit. Then the society, if it wants, can tax the corporation and use the money to do nicer things. But if they don't do that, the corporations don't do that, the economy will be less efficient. This is a very powerful moral justification of this individualist vision of the economy. In response to this quote from Adam Smith, the Swedish journalist Katrin Marshall wrote this very interesting book called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? She is asking, okay, Mr. Adam Smith, you say it's because of all these self-seeking behaviors of brewer, butcher, and baker that you have your dinner. Actually, who cooked your dinner? You didn't cook it. Yeah, in his case, it turns out to be his mother, because he was never married. And when his mother passed away, one of his cousins came and cooked for him. So Marshall is asking, look, household work has been completely written out of economics. He talks about the butchers and bakers that selling things and him having dinner, but what happens in between, there's no mention. Anyway, it's a very interesting and easy to read introduction to feminist economics, so you might want to check that out. So these are very appealing political and moral justifications have been very influential in making a lot of people accept this vision as the correct vision of our economy and society. But when you look at this more carefully, there are quite a few serious problems. Well, first of all, as for the political justification, actually, in reality, there's no clear relationship between a country's economic freedom and political freedom. A lot of dictatorships had very free market policies, like Chile under General Pinochet. A lot of democracies have low economic freedom because they have high taxes and lots of regulations. So in this view, I mean, Scandinavia is a very bad place. I mean, there's no economic freedom there. Well, I mean, not no, but little economic freedom there. And indeed, many supporters of this individualist view have argued that political freedom can be and has to be sacrificed for economic freedom. This is why people like Hayek and the Chicago economist Haberler openly supported the Chilean military dictatorship. They said the most important freedom is the freedom to use your property to make money. And if someone is trying to meddle with that, like the socialist government of Salvador Allende, it's only right that that group is removed and economic freedom restored. In terms of the moral justifications, we know that there are lots of economic theories, including neoclassical market failure approach, that says that unrestrained pursuit of self-interest by individuals may not produce socially desirable economic outcomes. Individual cost and benefits diverge from social cost and benefits very often, to use the neoclassical language, because of things like externality, public goods, monopoly. So actually, you cannot allow individuals to engage in unconstrained self-seeking. That is actually bad for society. So that moral justification given in this quote actually collapses. It's not simply because of the power of the idea that this view has become dominant. It's you have to put it in the context of real-world politics. Because this individualist view does not question the underlying distribution of income, wealth, and power, and therefore it is very much liked by people who hold strong positions in the status quo. We may also add that, that there are funding of particular political parties that have a pro-market view, pro-corporate view. Some of these people and companies might channel advertising spending towards a particular news media, which tend to support this view. So, another problem with this individualist vision, and this is something that has been very much emphasized by people like Herbert Simon and John Kenneth Galbraith, these economists have looked at the reality and tried to see how economic decisions are made. And they pointed out, look, at least from the late 19th century, this individualist vision of the economy has become outdated. Because with the rise of these giant corporations, you started having this very complicated decision-making structure, which makes decisions in a way that is completely different from what individuals do. Basically, the reality is that most important economic actions in our economies have been undertaken not by individuals, not by free individuals, but by large organizations with hierarchical, that is power-based decision-making structures. Corporations, governments, trade unions, and increasingly even international organizations. So individualist economic theories misrepresent the reality of economic decision-making by downplaying or even completely ignoring the role of organizations. The neoclassical economists emphasize that the individual is the smallest irreducible social unit. But philosophers, psychologists, and even some economists have long debated whether the individual is an entity that cannot be divided up further. All individuals possess conflicting preferences within themselves. This is known as the multiple self problem. Now, of course, this kind of phenomenon happens because people have multiple roles in their lives. So a man might be completely selfish in terms of sharing household work with his partner, but then he might be so selfless in a war and is willing to take a bullet for his comrade. In different contexts, different value systems, different preferences that rise above water, and that control the person. In another context, it would be another set of preferences. Another reason why there's the multiple self problem is due to what is known as the weakness of will. You know the story of Ulysses. He was sailing through this place where there are these sirens who sing beautiful songs and kind of hypnotize the sailors so that their ships crash and sink. But then Ulysses figured out in order to navigate this, you have to make the sailors deaf by putting wax in their ear. But then he had to hear things to navigate. So he asked people to climb on the mast of the ship so that he cannot jump to these sirens. Basically, sometimes we have weakness of will. We decide that I'm going to live a healthy lifestyle. And then I go to a restaurant and then I see chocolate brownies in the menu and then my will just crumbles and I have to order it. Now this problem of weakness of will bothered especially the Greek philosophers the old days so much that they even invented a name for it, acrasia. So basically the point is that because of the different roles that we play in different contexts, and because of our weakness of will, we are internally divided. We are not a coherent being. The second aspect is what I call the embedded individual. Individuals are not atoms because they are not clearly separable from other individuals. They are embedded in the society. Let me explain what I mean. Economists working in the individualist tradition do not ask where individual preferences come from. They treat them as the ultimate data generated from within sovereign individuals. And the idea is best summarized in this Latin phrase, which I'm not even going to try to read. I have never learned Latin. But translated, this means taste is not a matter of dispute. So you don't ask questions about why people like this, like that. If people like, trashy TV shows, give them to them. Yet our preferences are very strongly formed by our social environment, our family, our neighborhoods, our schooling, our social classes. Now this is different, but when I first came to this country in the late 80s as a graduate student, wine drinking was not very widespread here. So people normally drank beer, and they considered people drinking wine as this pompous, upper middle class people, and working class people. The joke would be like going to a wine bar would be becoming a class traitor. But then I saw this very interesting advertisement for a French beer, in which the stereotype was completely reversed. So this French beer advertisement was like these very trendy young people clubbing, they were drinking beer, and it would be kind of interspersed with these scenes of really kind of the grubby old men sitting in the provincial bars in France drinking wine like this, So in that country, actually, the beer was the trendy thing. So coming from different backgrounds, you don't just consume different things, but you actually want different things. This is known as the process of socialization. You basically get trained by the society how to behave. And this means that we cannot really treat individuals as atoms separable from each other, because individuals are if we use a fancy term, embedded in the society. They are not free of society. The third reason why the neoclassical individualist vision is problematic is because individuals are impressionable. We can be and we are deliberately manipulated by others. So the socialization process may not be deliberate. Simply coming from a working class background or coming from an immigrant family, no one's deliberately teaching you what to think, how to behave, but you kind of imbibe those things. But sometimes this influence is exercised deliberately by others. Now, frankly, most aspects of human life, whether it's education, religious teaching, the mass media, they all have some element of manipulation. So I'm not necessarily using this word manipulation in totally negative sense, but we have to recognize this dimension if we are to fully understand how individuals think and behave. And this manipulative aspect is taken seriously by some countries. So in countries like Sweden, Norway, and the state of Quebec in Canada, there could be other countries, advertising for children under the age of 12 is banned. So there is no advertisement for toys. When I was raising my son, I could see that. As soon as something comes on TV, he wants it. Why shouldn't he? Well, even in this country, which has the rather kind of liberal attitude towards these things, the advertisement for cigarette is banned. So, people do recognize the manipulative dimensions of advertising. Individual preferences are manipulated at the more fundamental level. Some people trying to impart a certain worldview that make their lives easier through funding political parties, funding research, giving advertising revenue to particular types of media and so on. So if you can convince poor people that their poverty is entirely their fault, if you convince those people that they shouldn't be asking anything from society, they should all try to stand on their own feet, and if you can make them think that this is a very noble moral position, then you don't need to deal with poverty. Because the poor people will then only blame themselves and try to cope with it in any way they can without demanding that there should be a bigger welfare state or targeted poverty programs or help with poor children. So that makes the life of the rich and the powerful easier. And then there's the issue of what I call the complicated individual, basically meaning that individuals have complex motivations. They are not unidimensionally selfish beings as portrayed in neoclassical economics. Now, of course, when you say this, quite a few neoclassical economists will say, oh, no, we recognize the existence of other motives. But then they say, we are just making a convenient assumption. It's not essential to neoclassical theory. When people say that, I think they are being disingenuous. Because if it was such a kind of non-consequential, such a marginal assumption, which is made only for the sake of convenience, why do 99% of neoclassical articles assume unidimensional self-seeking individuals? At least you can say that neoclassical economists tend to assume that self-seeking is the most natural motive and most important motive. Maybe not the only motive, but the most natural and most important. And when combined with the assumption of rationality, which we are going to go into a bit later, the conclusion is that we should let individuals do what they want. They know what they want, they know how to achieve it in the most effective way because they are rational beings. Let them be. There comes the recommendation for laissez-faire free market policies. Of course, people have, including many economists, but also philosophers, psychologists, and other people, have for centuries questioned this assumption of selfish individual. Well, essentially, let me just give you two broad main points. The first point is that self-seeking itself is actually too narrowly defined, with the implicit assumption that individuals are incapable of recognizing long-term systematic consequences of their actions, something that is known as enlightened self-interest. For example, in the 19th century, some capitalists in Europe actually openly advocated regulating child labor. They were not doing it entirely for the benefit of the children, because these were people who recognized that if you made these children work and not go to school, the quality of future labor force will be low. They wanted a better educated, healthier labor force. And they said, for that, we need to regulate child labor, even though that meant these people being able to make less money, because they were, all using child labor at the time. So this is an example of enlightened self-interest. It's for your long-term benefit, but you are willing to sacrifice short-term benefit for that. This is not unrecognized, but very rarely incorporated into neoclassical economic theories. And the second main point is that this vision of a selfish individual is very often wrong, simply wrong. Because people are not entirely selfish. Many people give to charities, they give their time to charities, they help strangers. These are just altruistic behavior. It's not even long-term self-interest, enlightened self-interest, because if you're helping a stranger, the chance of that stranger reciprocating is basically zero. To give you some more extreme examples, a fireman enters a burning building to save an old lady. A stranger jumps into a sea to save some children, even though they know that there's a very high chance of themselves being killed. How more altruistic can you be? When you die, your any amount of possible benefit cannot compensate for it. But people still do it. The point that I'm trying to make is not to deny that people are selfish. Very often, probably in majority of the cases, we are selfish, but we are also moved by other motivations, patriotism or class solidarity, our sense of fairness, friendship, love, even idle curiosity. The very fact that there are so many words that describe human motivations actually is a proof that we are very complex beings. So actually economists have wasted a lot of times trying to reconcile reality with their theories. So there have been huge debate on why people vote. But economists cannot understand because going to the voting booth costs you some time and maybe money. And then the chance of you affecting the election is at basically zero. So why should people vote? For ordinary people, this is not a paradox. This is what you do. This is your duty, this is your commitment, this is your participation. But when you have this unidimensional view of selfishness, it's something that you cannot understand. Why? Why would people do that? So basically, we have to recognize that we have very complex motivations. Very often we are selfish, but it's not the only motivation that we have, and ignoring those complexity of motivations make economic theories so much poorer. And finally, we have what I call the bumbling individual. Individuals are not as rational as assumed in neoclassical economic theory. In neoclassical theory, individuals are rational in the sense that they know all the possible states of the world in the future, and they are able to make very complicated calculations about the probabilities of each of these states, and then they do cost-benefit calculations, and then make a decision. The implication is that we let people be because they know what they're doing. This notion of rationality, assumed in most neoclassical economic models, is a rationality that no one actually in reality possesses. Yeah? Herbert Simon actually called this Olympian rationality. You know, it's like godlike rationality, the gods that reside in the Greek mountain of Olympus. Yeah? It's not human. Yeah? Or some people call this a hyper-rationality. Yeah? So it's a totally unrealistic assumption, but when you pointed out the standard rebuttal from many neoclassical economists is that, of course, it's just a simplifying assumption. But, you know, as far as the resulting prediction is correct, who cares whether the assumption is realistic or not? Yeah? You know, these days, this kind of defense really rings hollow, you know, because behind the 2008 financial crisis was this theory called efficient market hypothesis, which is basically predicated on this assumption that humans have hyper-rationality. And that has given us predictions that, you know, this kind of crisis will never happen. Well, the point is that people are basically not very rational. Herbert Simon called this bounded rationality. And so we are too easily swayed by emotion in our decisions. We've seen this in the financial market recently, you know, euphoria, wishful thinking, panic, herd instinct, undue pessimism, and whatnot. Our decision is heavily affected by the framing of the question. So you could give the two questions of same substance, and people will respond differently. So, for example, as a minor example, there was this research showing that if you ask the students to register by a certain date, but in one version you say, if you don't do that, you will get fined. Yeah? In another version, you will get a discount if you if you register early. The substance of the kind of thing is the same, but the researchers found that people registered early if it was put as a penalty rather than early register discount. Yeah? I'm not enough of a psychologist to tell you why this is the case, but it's a very simple example related to students that shows how the framing of the question is relevant. Yeah? Psychologists have shown that we tend to overreact to new information and underreact to existing ones. Once again, a lot of research in the financial market has shown this. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who actually earlier in his career worked with Herbert Simon and got the Nobel Prize in economics in 2002, argued that we have two systems of thinking. One is intuitive heuristic system. The other is a rational thinking system. And Kahneman pointed out that most of the time we are working with this heuristic way of thinking. Yeah? And only when we really kind of concentrate, we mobilize our rationalist thinking. So this means that most of the time we are making lots of irrational decisions. Yeah? So this is not to say that humans are incapable of rational thinking, rational choice, but this is not what they usually do. And above all, we are overconfident about our own rationality. We think we are cleverer than what we really are. So unless you try to incorporate some of these aspects into your theories are going to be highly unrealistic and produce misleading results. It's been at least 100 years, possibly 150 years, that individuals as decision makers have become marginal. I would say it's basically 18th century vision of the economy. When, yes, I mean, the companies were basically one capitalist, 25 workers being beaten up by the capitalists personally all the time and shouted at. Yeah, in that kind of the economy, maybe you can reasonably apply these individualist theories, but today the world is completely different. Yeah, now, I mean, you have these huge transnational corporations. The largest 200 transnational corporations produce something like 10% of world GDP. Some of them employed millions of people. In many countries, governments that have huge influence on how the economy is run. Usually they are the biggest single employer. In many countries, they could employ upward of 20% of the labor force. Individuals are not the atomistic, single-minded, selfish, and rational beings that is assumed in neoclassical economic theories. A paradoxical result of conceptualizing individuals as highly imperfect beings, different from what is assumed in the standard neoclassical economics, is that it actually makes individuals count more, not less. Because, for example, it's exactly because that we admit that individuals are products of society that we can appreciate more the free will of those who make decisions that go against social conventions, prevailing ideologies, and their class background. When we accept that human rationality is limited, we get to appreciate more the initiatives exercised by entrepreneurs. So actually, in a world of perfect rationality, there will be no entrepreneurs. Because everyone knows what is a good business opportunity. And everyone will be doing it. It's just a matter of getting there a bit earlier than others. Now, of course, emphasizing the importance of real choices does not mean that we can do anything we want. If you watch the Disney movies or read too many self-help books, you might think that you can achieve anything if you believe in yourself. But the options that people choose from or can choose from are usually very limited. Very often it's because of the limited resources that they command, but it is also because they are socially conditioned and are, basically taught to limit the range of what they want and what they think may be possible. This is done through the sort of less deliberate socialization process, but also through deliberate manipulation of people's preferences. So I think we need to question this vision of the individual and vision of the economy made up of this particular type of individuals assumed in neoclassical theory, and only when we incorporate the multifaceted and limited nature of individuals, we can begin to build theories that allow us to understand the complexity of the world. And that, I think, is the most important intellectual project that economists have to confront.